Good morning, Grace and Gritters. I hope you're having a lovely Wednesday. Grace and Grit is a place where we talk about life, motherhood, and everything in between. We talk about the real stuff, the messy stuff, the unspoken stuff. And we do it all without judgment or shame, only grace. Today we're going to continue with The Woman in the Mirror, Part 2. Last week we talked about what it means when we don't recognize ourselves. We talked about identity, grief, and the cost of adapting. We talked about meeting our new selves without trying to fix us. And we talked about the shift from survival to living. When we left off last week, we were talking about how we begin to recognize ourselves again. Not the version of ourselves from before everything got heavy, but the version of ourselves shaped by experience, wisdom, and resilience. And how that woman deserves to be known, deserves some room, and she absolutely deserves some grace. So today we're going to continue on, and we're going to start with talking about the fear of softness and losing control. One of the quiet fears that many women carry in this season is the fear that if they soften, everything will unravel. That if we stop holding ourselves together so tightly, something's going to slip. Something will be exposed and something will be lost. This fear doesn't mean you're controlling. It means you've learned that control kept you safe. In survival seasons, control becomes a form of protection. You learn how to anticipate problems before they happen. You learn how to manage emotions so they don't interfere with what needs to be done. And you learn how to stay composed, capable, and contained. That composure becomes part of your identity. So when life invites you to soften, well, it can feel threatening. Softness feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like a risk. But softness is not the absence of strength. It's the absence of armor. Armor was necessary once. It protected you. It helped you endure. But armor is heavy. And carrying it long after the battle ends, that leads to a fatigue you cannot explain. Many of us confuse our survival armor with our identity. We think, well, if we take it off, who are we? But you are not your coping mechanisms. You are not your hyper responsibility. You're not your emotional restraint. And you're not your constant self control. Those were strategies. They helped you survive, but they don't define you. Letting go of them doesn't mean you become reckless or unstable. It means you become responsive instead of reactive. There's also a fear that if you acknowledge how tired you are, how much you've been carrying, that we'll just be overwhelmed by it. That if we let ourselves feel it, we're not going to be able to stuff it back down. But emotions don't work that way. What overwhelms us is it's not feeling, it's resisting. What exhausts us is not grief, it's suppression. When emotions are allowed to move, they soften. When they're held back, they harden. Many of us are not numb because we don't feel. We're numb because we've been holding our feelings in place for way too long. Softness doesn't make you fragile, it makes you flexible. Rigid things break, flexible things adapt. And you already know how to adapt. You've been doing it your entire life. This season simply asks you to adapt in a different direction, not towards the endurance, but towards presence. And presence requires trust. Trust that you can handle what comes up. Trust that you won't fall apart if you're honest. Trust that you don't need to control everything to be okay. Trust often feels really uncomfortable at first, especially if you spent the better part of your life being the one who holds things together. Letting go of that role doesn't mean you're abandoning responsibilities. It just means we're releasing unnecessary weight. We're cleaning out our purse and getting rid of all the junk. Feels a little lighter. The important stuff's still in there. We just got rid of the stuff we don't need right now. There's a difference between responsibility and over responsibility. Responsibility is healthy, it acknowledges your role. Over responsibility assumes that everything depends on you. Many of us have lived in over responsibility so long, we don't know how to rest internally. Even though we're physically resting, our mind is still rolling. Our body is still tense and our emotions are still on high alert. That's not a personal failure, it's conditioning. And conditioning, it can be undone gently. Not through force, not through pressure, but through safety. Safety is what allows softness. Now, I'm not talking about hard hats and safety glasses and PPE. Safety might look like allowing yourself to say no without explaining, or letting somebody else take the lead, or maybe you're just going to sit with your feelings for a little bit instead of rushing to fix them or hide them. But these are small shifts. Still significant, however, because every time you choose presence over performance, you send yourself a message. I don't have to earn rest. I don't have to earn compassion. I don't have to earn my own attention. And that message will slowly change how you see yourself. You stop seeing yourself only through the lens of what you do, and you're going to start noticing who you are underneath the doing. That woman may feel quieter, slower, more reserved. She may also feel more real. And real doesn't require constant effort. There's a grief in this part of the process too. Grief for how long you believed that you had to be a certain way, and grief for how long you carried things along. That grief doesn't mean you're resentful, it means you're aware. Awareness is not blame, it's clarity. And clarity allows choice. You may not be able to change everything about your life right now, but you can change how you relate to yourself inside it. You can stop demanding so much of yourself. Stop demanding endurance when gentleness is needed. You can stop asking yourself to be who you were then when the season required more of you than what you had. You're allowed to soften, and softness will not undo you. It will just introduce you to parts of yourself that survived quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. And that's where the woman in the mirror begins to look familiar again. There's a version of you that deserves to be honored before you can fully move forward. Not because you need to stay there, but because she carried you through. And many of us try to skip this step. We want to rush into growth, clarity, healing, without acknowledging who we had become to survive. But skipping this part often leads to frustration because unacknowledged versions of ourselves don't disappear. They linger like a little hater. They're not hating, but that's how they feel. The woman you had been in survival mode was not a mistake. She was resourceful. She was capable. She was resilient. She made decisions with limited information, limited energy, and she kept going. And she deserves gratitude, not resentment. But she's not required to lead forever. Releasing who you had to be does not mean you're rejecting her. It means you're recognizing that her role may be complete. That can feel pretty complicated because she's a part of you. Because when an identity kept you safe, letting go of it can feel like you're letting go of security. Even if that identity is exhausting, it's familiar. And familiar is something that can feel a whole lot safer than freedom. So many of us stay in a survival pattern long after we need it. Not because we want to, but because we don't know who we are without it. What if I'm not the strong one? What if I'm not the fixer? What if I stop carrying everything? These questions can feel threatening, but they're also invitations. They invite you to explore identity beyond function, beyond roles or expectations, beyond what others need from you. You're more than what you manage. You're more than what you endure. And you are more than how well you can hold it together. And this realization, it brings mixed emotions. Relief, sadness, fear, hope, all of the above. And all of them can exist at the same time. And letting go doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. Don't you just love that? It all comes up fast, slowly, quiet, like sneak attacks in the night. And then we got to unfold it slowly, like layers. You may notice moments when you try to go back to your old patterns, even when you don't really need them. And you might feel uncomfortable if you don't immediately respond to something or fix something or manage something. It doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're learning something new. You're stepping out of what was your comfort zone. And new always feels awkward. Just because it's unfamiliar doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Remember, we're doing something different. And there's also going to be some guilt. Guilt for wanting more ease, for not wanting to struggle anymore, for outgrowing identities that others still think you are, that's not laziness. And that ain't weakness. Outgrowing survival is not betrayal. It's growth. That's a good thing. You're allowed to want a life that feels sustainable and not just survivable. You're allowed to want joy that doesn't require justification. And you're allowed to want a relationship with yourself that isn't built on constant effort. This is where many of us begin to feel compassion for ourselves in a deeper way, not the surface level kind that says, I'm doing my best, but the kind that says, what I did, it made sense. Given what I was carrying, I crushed that. That compassion, that creates space. Space to breathe, space to feel, space to choose differently. And in that space, something shifts. You stop seeing your past self as something to escape, and you start seeing her as someone to thank. You acknowledge her strength without letting it define your future. Honor her endurance without requiring it forever. This is how identity evolves. You don't erase who you were, you build on her. And that makes the woman in the mirror feel less foreign. Not because she looks like who you used to be, but because you understand how she got here. Understanding creates familiar. I can't say that word. When you have the understanding, it feels familiar. And when it feels familiar, that creates acceptance. And acceptance allows peace. But that's not the end of your journey. It's just a turning point. Because once you release who you had to be, now you're making room for who you're becoming. And that woman, she deserves some attention. There's a difference between living from obligation and living from within. Obligation pulls you outward. It focuses your attention on expectations, needs, responsibilities. Living within draws you inward. It asks you to notice what's happening inside before you respond to what's on the outside. Most women in survival seasons live almost entirely from obligation. We learn how to read a room, anticipate needs, and adjust accordingly. We literally pivot on a dime. And over time, the outward focus, it's automatic. So when survival ends, we don't know how to check ourselves. We don't know how to ask, what do I need? We just know how to ask what needs to be done. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're selfish or unaware. It means that your internal compass has been overridden by necessity. Relearning to live from within is not about ignoring your responsibilities, it's about restoring balance. It starts with noticing your internal responses without hitting that override button. Noticing when something feels heavy instead of pushing through it. When something feels draining instead of just dismissing it. Or when something brings you satisfaction instead of just brushing it aside. These moments, most of the time, they're subtle, but they matter. Because every time you acknowledge your inner experience, you strengthen your connection to yourself. Living within doesn't require a drastic change. You don't need to be cutting your hair, dyeing it, going crazy. Just pay attention to yourself. Pay attention to what energizes you, what feels meaningful right now, not what used to define you. Pay attention to what your body and emotions are signaling instead of hitting the silence button on them too. It's going to feel uncomfortable because most of us have learned to distrust our needs or to push them aside. We put ourselves on the back burner. But ignoring ourselves, that comes with a cost. Disconnection doesn't happen suddenly, it happens because we repeatedly dismiss our needs. Well, reconnection works the same way. It happens through repeated acknowledgement. You don't need to overhaul your life to reconnect to yourself. You don't need to abandon you don't need to stop abandoning yourself in small moments. There are going to be times in our life where we have to push ourselves aside for a minute. Just don't forget to go back to you. Small moments like saying yes when you mean no, or staying silent when something matters to you. Small moments like dismissing your fatigue because others have it worse. We got to stop doing this. These moments accumulate, and so do moments of return. Moments where you pause and ask yourself for what you're feeling, where you choose to rest without guilt. Girl, go take you a nap. Sit down for 3 minutes. Tell them kids, Mama needs 5 minutes. Set a timer. Moments where you honor your limits instead of pushing past them. Living from within also requires discernment. Not everything you feel requires action, but everything you feel requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement doesn't create chaos, it creates clarity. When you ignore your inner world, it grows louder in unhelpful ways. When you listen to it, it settles. There's also some deep um, recalibration that's going to happen. Values shift, priorities change. What once felt urgent before, it may not matter much anymore. What once felt optional, well, that might be essential now. That's going to make you feel like, well, it could be like knock you off balance, destabilizing, especially if your identity has been tied to certain roles or achievements or progress. But identity that evolves, it's not lost, it's refined. You're not becoming less, you're just getting aligned. And alignment doesn't always feel exciting. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it feels like letting go of things you thought you needed to keep. It's like spring cleaning, but in your mind, body, and soul. But do better at that spring cleaning than we do our other spring cleaning, because if you're like me, I procrastinate that. This is, most of the time, this is the part where the woman in the mirror begins to feel familiar again. Not because she resembles the past version of you, but because you recognize the emotional language. You know what drains her. You know what steadies her. You know what she needs to feel grounded. And that knowledge doesn't come from self analysis, it comes from attention. Living from within is a practice, it's not a destination. You're still going to have days where obligations take over. Doesn't mean you failed, it means you're human. But there's a difference now. It's awareness. And awareness is going to allow you to put your armor on and then take it back off and hang it on the coat rack. Because you only needed it for a minute. You don't need it all week. You just needed it for this minute. And every time you're able to return back to yourself, every time you're able to take your armor back off and hang it on a coat rack, you're going to build trust. Trust that you're not going to abandon yourself again, that your needs matter, and that you can be present without falling apart. And that changes everything. Because once you can trust yourself, you're not going to need to have that armor hanging on the coat rack. Because you can be met as you are. We have got to give ourselves grace, okay? And we've got to stop asking, why am I like this? And start asking, how did I become this way? And if you do that, it's going to shift everything because we're curious about other things. We don't always go harsh judgment on everybody else. So that's because curiosity is softer than judgment. It it opens something up instead of shutting it down. It invites understanding, knowledge instead of criticism. Seeing yourself with grace does not mean excusing everything or avoiding growth. It means putting your life in honest context. You begin to see the woman in the mirror as not a problem, but a story that makes sense. And it is a best selling novel, y'all. You see the seasons that shaped her, the responsibilities that formed her, and the moments where she chose endurance over ease. You're going to see her quietness is not emptiness, and her restraint is not coldness. Her strength, that's not hardness. They're adaptations. And those are intelligent responses to lived experience. And when you can understand that, self compassion stops feeling forced and it becomes natural. You stop demanding explanations of why you're tired. You stop criticizing yourself. You stop comparing who you are now to who you used to be. And you also begin to recognize that grace doesn't require you to stay the same. It gives you permission to grow without shame. It allows you to say, this version of me was necessary, and I don't have to remain here forever. Growth rooted in grace is not frantic, it's intentional. It doesn't demand immediate change, it doesn't pressure you to have everything figured out, it doesn't rush the process. It respects timing. This is especially important for those of us who's lived in urgency for a long time because urgency trains us to act quickly, decide fast, and move on. And grace asks us to slow down internally, even when life keeps moving. That's not laziness, that's wisdom. And wisdom recognizes that sustainable change doesn't come from pressure, it comes from safety. Safety allows you to soften your inner dialogue. Girl, quit bad mouthing yourself. Safety allows you to release self criticism. Girl, don't be so hard on yourself. Safety allows you to admit uncertainty without panic. Girl, don't none of us know. It's good though. And uncertainty, it's not a threat. It's a transition space. You don't have to know exactly who you're becoming to trust that you can move forward. I mean, it's you. You don't have to define yourself in rigid terms. You don't have to explain yourself to everyone, and you don't have to justify the pace of your growth. You're allowed to evolve quietly. It might not be a dramatic transformation. Like I said, don't go cutting and dyeing your hair. It might be about subtle shifts that accumulate over time, small choices that honor our energy or per boundaries that protect our peace, or moments where we choose presence over performance. Those choices reshape identity. They make the woman in the mirror feel like somebody you know, someone you respect, and someone you're learning to trust. And grace also invites forgiveness. Not because you did something wrong, but because holding yourself to impossible standards that creates unnecessary suffering, and forgiveness releases the belief that you should have known better, and it acknowledges that you did the best you could with what you had. You don't need to punish yourself for surviving. You don't need to prove your worth. And you're allowed to receive ease without earning it through exhaustion. Many of us equate worth with effort, but worth is inherent. And when you begin to believe that, your relationship with yourself is gonna change. You stop bracing for disappointment, expecting yourself to fail. You're gonna stop viewing your inner world as something to manage. You begin to inhabit it. Inhabiting yourself is a quiet and powerful shift. It means you're no longer observing your life from the outside, you're participating in it. You're present in your choices, you're honest about your limits, you're aware of your needs without shame, and slowly the mirror stops feeling like a stranger. Not because you look the same as you once did, but because you can see clearly, and clarity brings peace. At some point, the mirror changes. Not the glass, not the reflection, your posture. You're going to stop scanning yourself for what's missing. You stop evaluating what you should be by now. You stop looking for evidence that something went wrong. Instead, you simply see a woman who has endured seasons that require more than she ever expected to give. A woman who adapted, adjusted, and carried weight quietly. You see someone who didn't disappear. She responded. And that distinction matters because disappearing implies loss. Responding implies intelligence. You responded to life as it was. And now, life is asking something different of you. Not urgency, not endurance, not sacrifice at the expense of yourself. It's asking for presence. Presence with yourself. Presence with the woman you've become. Presence with the truth that you don't need to rush this season or define it prematurely. You don't need a label of who you are now. You don't need to explain your evolution. And you don't need to justify why you're quieter, slower, or more selective. You're allowed to exist without performing. This woman in the mirror does not need to be impressive. She needs to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is powerful. It says, I see you. It says, you make sense. And it says, you don't have to keep proving your worth. Many women are still living as though survival is just around the corner, even when it's not. We're braced for impact, and it never comes. We're just holding ourselves together long after we're safe enough to just. And softening, it doesn't mean falling apart. It's exhaling. It means releasing the belief that tension equals strength. It means trusting that you can be present without unraveling. The woman in the mirror, she's learned a lot. She knows what drains her, she knows what steadies her, and she knows what no longer fits. She may not know exactly what comes next, but that's okay. Clarity is not always the first gift of healing. Sometimes peace comes first. Peace with not knowing, peace with being in the process, peace with allowing things to unfold rather than forcing resolution. This season, it doesn't require answers, it just requires honesty. Honesty about what's been too heavy, what we've outgrown, and what do you need now? Honesty doesn't need to be loud. It can be quiet, private, internal. Some of the most profound shifts happen without a witness. You don't need an audience for your healing. You don't need to announce your healing. You don't need to explain your boundaries. And you don't need to defend your peace. You're allowed to move gently. And maybe that's the invitation in all this. Not to become someone new, not to return who we were, but to remain with who we are. To stop turning away when you catch your reflection. To stop scanning for flaws. And to stop wondering when you'll feel like yourself again. Because maybe this is what it feels like to be yourself after life happens, after responsibility, after endurance, after survival. The woman in the mirror is not a stranger. She's just someone you haven't had time to know yet. And she deserves patience. And she deserves compassion. And she deserves grace. Not because she's unfinished, but because she's human. And that's enough. Guys, we have got to remember that we are awesome. Flaws, imperfectness, crazy mess, and all. You are awesome. And you are enough. So the next time you look at the woman in the mirror, show her some grace and some love. Thank you for sharing this space with me. I will see you guys next time.